The Knights of Ren podcast is brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., your source for Star Wars Destiny singles, sealed product, and more. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.
Show me again the power of the darkness.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll. D20radio.com.
If you come with us, you're in this life for good.
You might wanna buckle up, baby.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the Knights of Ren, episode 514. With me this week is just Nick. Hey, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing good. I just got Legion, and it's awesome. And I'm still playing Destiny, so that's also awesome.
I know the rare occurrence of playing multiple games at the same time. Rick and Todd are off taking care of business, family, and of course the classic
Too sick to come to work?
Too sick to come to work. Yeah, they're calling in sick today. So we wish them well. We'll send them some muffins from Lord Kylo, have them check out a six-pack, make sure everything's going well. But this week, we are still going to dissect decks and talk about what we expect to see in the meta at Worlds, because we are still 3 weeks out, and there's so much to talk about. But before we get into that, so we did have some changes to the Holocron for the standard format. Balance of the Force didn't change, set legality didn't change. We saw two pieces of errata, running interference, which everyone expected, and Maul's lightsaber, which everyone may or may not have expected. So we're going to tackle that really quick, and let's first talk about running interference. So basically, in a nutshell, if you haven't heard it already, you can use running interference one time, and then after you use it, you put it into your set aside, exiled, removed from game zone, whatever you want to call it. Same thing as hyperspace jump. You use it, and then it's just gone. You can't access it by any other means. There's no way to cheat it back out from your discard pile or anything like that. It is removed from the game. So what do you think this is going to have an impact on outside of Sabine? Because we're going to talk about that specifically here in a moment.
I think it hurts the Obi-Maz matchup the Obi-Maz deck quite a bit, actually. What a lot of people would use it for is being able to play like concentrate and then running interference to stop them from messing with the dice, which will work in the two instances that you have concentrate for the only two times you might want to use running interference with it. But what it also doesn't do, and it used to help out a lot with, is if you had like double running interference, or in general just being able to do like a truce or a vibra knife to get the ambush, play a card to do that, and then roll out Obi-Wan to protect his dice for that one action before Maz gets to roll out. So whether he rolls good or bad there, your dice would have been protected for one round with running interference, and now you just can't really afford to use the one-time effect of running interference for something like that. It would have to be saved for something big like concentrate, which just kind of means that he's always going to be a little bit more vulnerable than something like Sabine, because you're always going to have that one action to be able to at least remove one of his dice, or two, or whatever type of removal you have.
So if someone's like playing Obi-Maz and they want to continue playing with a deck, do you feel like this is going to stop Obi-Maz from ever hitting the tables again? Or is there another flavor of Obi-Maz, like maybe more of a control variant that can still play the team and they don't rely on running interference as much for, big plays or for lockouts?
I don't know. It's going to be hard to say, because I don't know that now's really the time to be experimenting enough with it. It might be enough to knock the deck in its current form out of a lot of play. Not that it's bad, or like it might not be a tier 1 deck right now. Like it might have been hit just enough to dump it down a bit, but I don't think that we're really going to see a new big breakaway Obi-Wan deck come out now between now and Worlds, because there's just all the most competitive players that are going to Worlds aren't going to be probably experimenting with Obi-Wan as much as other possible answers to the meta.
What about Zeb? I know he's a very powerful character that a lot of people are trying to pair with Yoda and figure out if he fits in the meta. Do you think running interference being pulled away from that team is going to impact the validity of the deck, or at least in terms of it being seen at Worlds specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that's not a deck you see a lot of now, but it certainly hurts that. Like anything that doesn't play, like anything that plays a little bit more fair than Sabine is going to be a little bit at odds with this change. It's just not going to work as well for the deck. I mean, at least some things you have going for Yoda Zeb, you can still like roll out your character with force speed and force speed into Zeb. It'd never tell me the odds with Infamous. Like you can still do like a perfect combo where your dice are untouchable and Zeb rolls out, as long as you have like force speed and Infamous. It's possible, but I don't know if we're gonna see much of that either. Poor Zeb.
Yeah, Poor Zeb. He just kind of took one to the face and he's not getting anything back for it. And then, of course, another card that we were all kind of wondering about, but we weren't sure if FFG was actually going to do anything about, was Maul's lightsaber. So the new errata says that essentially you have to spend one resource to roll the die out into the pool. Originally, it just said, you know, if your opponent has no shields on any of their characters as a power action, you roll the die back out. Now they have to have no shields on their characters and you have to spend a resource to do it. So if you have no money, you can't use the Maul saber unless you somehow generate a resource. Now, there's a lot more speculation on this over running interference, because a lot of people have said with running interference, you can just throw in Infamous, take out running interference, and essentially do the same thing with Never Tell Me the Odds for the big blowout play. But with Maul's lightsaber, you now have to balance your economy, because you can't just get the third resource, put the lightsaber down, roll out, deal some damage, roll the lightsaber back out again, and go for these huge blowout plays on turn one. So just tell me some of the thoughts you have about this.
I mean, I'm really happy to see this one because it does not kill the card in any means, and it does not kill like hardly any of the decks that run the card. What it does is it takes away some of the just completely random, crappy feeling blowouts that happen on round one when your opponent uses a well-connected or a truce, plays down Maul Saber, and it's just there permanently. Say they got the shield, starting shields, you don't have anything, you don't have any way of generating shields, you're just going to eat like 6 to 8 damage extra that round because of Maul Saber, and it's going to feel awful. So like that's just, it's just a feel bad card if it gets out early, and this change, it doesn't make it impossible to do well early, it just really hurts the odds of it actually being able to punish you as much in the first round of the game. And that's why I think it's still a very strong card. It is still ahead of the curve for a lot of the 3-cost upgrades, and it's even like an extremely good late game card when you'll have some more extra money and just need to punch through, because in the late game it basically acts as 2 upgrades on your character. So yeah, it's a great card. I'm glad to see that they toned it down a little bit. It'll definitely slow down Boba 7th and the OTK variants.
But is that, I guess, a real interesting question that's been popping up in discussions that have been had is this something that's going to reduce or remove OTK and Boba 7th from the meta? I mean, like, I don't think so, but, you know, some people say, oh, you know, without Maul Saber, you know, those decks can't compete with other explosive decks, and I don't think that's true, but I think it's something worth discussing just because that one resource is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, Boba 7th, I don't think it's hit so minimally that I don't think that there's any reason. It didn't go down in power by any reasonable margin. It just kind of made some matchups slightly better against it. Like, or not even that they're better. It's just that they're just not likely to get God rolled out of the game in the first round. So it's just kind of like well, that's a relief. But the deck's still extremely strong. In all the other games that you don't get Maul Saber out round one and blow people up, it still does very well. So it's not like it's a bad deck if you don't get Maul Saber out. I think OTK got hit quite a bit harder with that, but it's still the same principle. Where like early game round 1 or even round 2, it's really hard to actually just get, like, you're not going to be able to chain off Maul Saber 3 or 4 times before the end of the game as well, because of like that power action not being able to go off, and you're going to get the reactivates with your sister still, but it's going to be a lot harder to find the power action unless you have stuff out there like Aftermath. And if you have Aftermath early, then you don't have other cards early. Like it's kind of a perfect storm. Yes, it can do just as much as it used to do before, but made it just a little bit harder for it to blow out as early as it used to. So I think it's fine, and we'll probably still see some OTK. I don't think it's going to dominate the meta for Worlds either, but
well, that's something I think is way more interesting to talk about. Like, a lot of people have seen the Holocron update and we've all discussed, you know, what it is and what it does, but I'm more interested in like, what does this effect have on Worlds? Does this push away some of the heavier aggro decks? Like, you know, everyone says the decks that are in conversation are basically Sabine, any flavor of OTK, and then your Boba 7. So those are the 3 decks that really this affected the most. You have all those other fringe decks that might run a running interference, or you have the more well-known Obi Maz or Obi X, or, you know, Zeb, or, you know, something that uses yellow. So you've got all of these decks that it affects, but the more popular and well-known ones are those 3 we just mentioned. Do you think that players are going to gravitate towards something else now that these two cards have been not nerfed to unplayability, but they've reduced the consistency and explosivity of, the Maul's lightsaber plays on turn 1 and the blowout plays for running interference and never tell me the odds.
I think that is definitely a better question than whether it's actually better or worse, because while it might not actually be that big of a power change, it is quite possible that people will just change their minds more. I don't know. My guess would be that Sabine players would be more likely to change based on the running interference change. I mean, it certainly doesn't break the deck or make it any worse. Well, it does make it worse, just not by a significant margin. It lets your opponents actually have a chance of maybe outclaiming you, because you can't just constantly stop them with running interference from activating and stuff. Like, what running interference lost is its ability to maintain tempo on top of protecting your dice. Like, the card is just too good. So I mean, we might see people flock away from those decks.
So more speculation. I love talking about worlds and decks and matches. With the need for resources, does that give Hondo more space to play around? Because you have to have resources to use Maul Saber over and over again. And if Hondo just sits there and hits you with specials, that's a lot of damage. Or if you give them the resources, now that means less damage for you because you're not rolling out the Saber. Like, is this shifting the meta? Not necessarily like over defining like, oh, it's all a Hondo meta, Hondo. But like, Hondo had a place before, but now that you can't, use running interference to lock people out and you have to have money for lightsabers, does that give other decks more relevance in the meta?
Yeah, I certainly think that Hondo is very happy for this change, especially because that's a deck that is more susceptible to the round 1 blowout. If you're playing against a deck, they got something like Friends in Low Places, so that you lose like one of your key mitigation cards, and then they just roll out and hit the nuts damage round 1, and if they do 8 damage to one of your 10 health characters round 1, you're going to lose that game most likely, unless you're killing a character round 2 yourself, and it has to be a decent one, not just like an Ezra and a Sabine Ezra. So like, if as long as you can fight back hard enough, you might be okay. But yeah, the decks that have the really high end in round 1 are the things that are much scarier for Yoda Hondo. So with those being hit a little bit more with this errata, then yeah, I mean Yoda Hondo's in a great spot. I mean, Poe Hondo I think is fine, but at this point I think Yoda Hondo just handles things a little bit better, makes a little bit more money. You have Force Wave, and Force Wave's pretty crazy. And then vehicles I wouldn't say that vehicles really got much better from this one. Like, there's really not much direct effect. I guess the best thing for vehicles is that Boba 7th is much less likely to kill a character round 1 with like a Maul Saber going over and over, but that wasn't necessarily always, as long as you had mitigation, and you were usually pretty fine there, as long as they didn't roll perfectly.
I just find it interesting that we all speculated a lot of things could happen, and the Holocron was fairly small in terms of like the text that was actually printed, but I think it has a very unique shift to what we're going to see at Worlds.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see. And there's not a lot of big events going forward coming up to Worlds to even be able to say, oh, hey, this is what you're looking at for the Worlds meta. We had a couple GQs this weekend, Galactic qualifiers, I think in PAX East in Boston, and then one in, was it Spain or Italy this weekend as well?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was Italy, if I'm not mistaken.
So yeah. We had 2 more Galactic qualifiers this weekend, but that's still using, with pre-errata stuff here, so I don't know how much the meta really changed for that. I mean, the last big thing is we have our Artificery tournament coming up in a couple weeks, and that'll be the last notable thing that I can think of that'll have a reasonable amount of people for tournament wise before Worlds. So hopefully use that as our gauge to see, hey, this is what you should expect. These are the top decks. And
I'm very intrigued because the meta didn't actually shift and break and these decks are unplayable, but it did adjust to the point where you can't really get locked out by RI anymore. And with Maul Saber, if you're sitting on a disrupt and they have 1 resource, that might be a very valuable play. Like, those are things you can now consider. Whereas before, you cared about shields. Like, you wanted your dice to show shields. So after they dealt you damage, you put shields back on and they couldn't roll out the Saber. Now, if you have Disrupt and they have 1 resource, that is just as valuable.
Well, not even just that. Like, the other thing that's actually like more notable, what's the worst feel bad moment is seeing a Maul Saber on a +4 and knowing that if you remove that die, you're probably at most like you might remove 2 damage, but you might not. It might be worse than that after it comes back out. Like, it feels absolutely terrible to remove a Maul saber die. And that, I think, is part of the problem with it. So, like, if you think of it now, it's like, well, I could remove that +4. And then if he doesn't have resources, you're just golden. If he does have resources, you're like, well, he has to spend resources on that. And maybe that gives me, you know, the edge of him not being able to use a removal against me. So I'm able to do the rest of my turn. Like, removing that die, forcing him to actually pay the resource, or even just having to lose more base sides from their other dice. Like, it's much harder to actually get it off than it was before. And it's a lot less punishing to actually remove the main die.
Yeah, I agree. It's just really interesting how just adding spend 1 resource to the actual card text changes a lot of very intricate things, which means the deck itself has to be piloted in a different direction. Like, you're still doing the same thing. You're still dealing damage. You're still rolling out dice. But now you have to micromanage your economy, and you have to be aware of disrupt symbols, where before, you know, you didn't care. A disrupt symbol meant literally nothing. Now that's another factor. So it's just really neat. Like, the game is becoming more interesting in terms of, you know, you have to be aware of many more variables, not just roll dice, resolve dice, claim battlefield. Like, your timing is important, your sequencing is important. Like, all the things we've talked about over the year has been basically amplified. Like, it does matter when you roll your characters, and it doesn't matter how much money you have available, and so on and so forth, which is going to make for a great Worlds event. I'm super excited because we're going to have so many people there. I mean, it's going to be a big party. We're going to hang out, we're going to have fun, we're going to meet so many people who play Destiny, who play X-Wing, who play all these other stuff. Like, we've made so many friends since last year that we didn't know the year prior. Like, we showed up to Worlds, and, you know, like Agent of Zion, we didn't really know him. We knew him on the forums, we knew him on Discord, but we'd never actually, you know, met him face to face. And now it's like, you know, guys like a brother to us. You know, you're the exact same way. We didn't know you except for when you took second, and then, you know, here you are. And all these friendships have, you know, grown since, you know, last year, and there's so many new people to meet. I'm just really excited.
Yeah, Worlds is going to be the best event in Star Wars Destiny to date. It's going to be the biggest, it's going to be the most competitive, and it's just going to be, you know, like 4 to 5 days of just absolute nonstop fun and heartache. Probably there's going to be heartache somewhere in there for a lot of us.
Oh yeah. I mean, it makes for a great story, you know, as an entertainer. Like, that is valuable because we can, you know, tell the highs, we can tell the lows, we can talk about the Cinderella story, we can talk about, you know, D-House is going to hate it, but, you know, last year he lost 2 games to 1 unpredictable roll, and 1 in 6 chance killed him. You know, I think it was game 3 and game 4. Like, he lost to like the lowest of chances, 1 card. And, you know, we don't wish that he lost, but it's a fun story to tell that, you know, 1 card, 1 roll, everything came down to the wire, and what mattered was hitting that 1 in 6 chance. And it's like, oh my gosh, you know, like, people are watching, and you hear this, just, you're like 5 or 6 people going, ooh, and then, you know, like 3 or 4 people run over. It's like, what happened? And, you know, it's like, well, this guy just rolled, you know, his 2 damage on Bala to kill him, and he used unpredictable, so his ambush, so he shot him and he won the game. And, you know, you see that, you know, D-House is showing lethal on the other side, and you're like, whoa, like, the entire game came down to a single roll and a 1 in 6 chance. Like, that's incredible, and that's amazing. And, you know, he's a great sport, and we're gonna send him some signed copies of Unpredictable and probably sew it into a t-shirt just for funsies. But, like, stuff like that, like, those kinds of stories you don't really get very often from anywhere, hardly. So it's just really exciting to just go to this event, meet all these people, and have a blast.
Yep, it's going to be awesome.
All right, so as we prepare for Worlds, we still have more decks to talk about. So let's just jump into our decks tech this week, and we're going to talk about vehicles. We're going to talk about Mill. So I'm going to talk about Mill first off because that's my favorite. I love this deck. I think that the update might have given Mill a little bit of leg room. Now, it's not going to be like crazy amounts of leg room just because your Mill decks don't really choke very hard. I mean, like, if you have a Yoda and you're sitting on a disrupt and they only have 1 resource, it's probably a valuable consideration to take that resource away. But you also make shield so quickly, it might not be worth your time to try and stop the, like, use the disrupt to try and stop the die, because you might just be able to shield up faster anyways. So there's just a lot of things to consider. What's more interesting for at least Mill decks is the running interference lock, because there's like nothing you can really do once they play running interference, lock you out, hit you with never telling me the odds, and then Yoda is practically dead. You just really don't have any way to get around it because you're not running anything like honor guard on the table. But with the Maul's lightsaber, that does change things because you can have a little bit of interaction with your opponent's resources depending on who you're running. I mean, your Partisan, your Yoda, they both have disrupt sides. So it does make that die a little bit more valuable, but, you know, that's just kind of a fringe case scenario where you're looking at, you know, one resource, a die, damage, shields, all that stuff happening. And you just have to make a decision like, do I try and re-roll? Do I focus? Stuff like that. But I digress. Getting back into mill. So if you're looking at your traditional mill deck, there's actually a couple different flavors of mill. So you've got the traditional standard stuff, which is Yoda, Jedi Partisan, and Riken. That is, you know, like the stock fundamental mill deck where you put shields on your guys, you use Riken to mill, you use Yoda to flip and mill, you use Jedi to mill, you're throwing things like easy pickings and tangle because of your yellow character, you use garbage shoot on the Partisan, and I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You force meditation, you're just taking cards off the top of their deck, you're mitigating away their dice, and you're trying to stay alive longer. But there are some more non-traditional types of mill decks that, you know, if you're afraid of mill or you're looking to pilot mill, you should be aware of. There is the Yoda Riken Elite team up. So it's just red blue. It's a very aggressive version of mill where you're running things like scout, you're pushing your limit to try and flip your dice to get cards out of their hand, get cards off the table. You've got your chance cube and C3PO. You can run things like medical droid if you want. There's a lot of flexibility in that deck. You know, you can run mend, you've got trench, stuff like that. You're making shields, you're healing. So it's a different variant because the rainbow mill is giving you access to I guess removal? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You've got good removal, but I would call it mid-range. It's more of a mid-range mill because I'm personally working on a toolbox mill that is completely different than
mid-range is even the right. It's just a weird. It's the getting 3 dice and having a solid mill deck right now, or the 3 characters tends to lead you to the Rainbow Riken build, and it's just it doesn't have a lot of dice. It's got good removal with easy pickings and garbage shoot. It's got a lot of shields, but like your dice don't do a lot. You're not actually actively milling a lot with that. Most of your milling's coming from, you know, Riken himself on top of what you can just sneak out with the Yoda or the Partisan. So maybe mid-range is the right word for it. I don't know. It's kind of a weird way of comparing mill decks.
Well, I mean, like in your like Magic the Gathering, in terms of mid-range, like you're essentially trying to set up your board so that by turn 3, turn 4, you either have such a heavy presence that you're going to win, or you're set up where it's just very difficult, if not impossible, to stop you. So your Riken mill, like your Riken Yoda, is heavy aggression. Like you're just pushing to get cards out. You know, you're just gunning for it as fast as you can. You can actually claim because you only have 2 characters. You've got a lot of things that have specials. So you can do special chaining and just get cards out of their hand, out of their deck pretty quickly. With the Riken Yoda Partisan, like you have a little bit more space for removal because you've got the yellow. You've actually got a body to throw into the garbage chute. You've got plenty of health. You've got ways to deal shields. You've got ways to mill. You've got ways to flip. Like you can do a lot of things. So you kind of want to set yourself up with, you know, your C3PO, your chance cube, your scrap heap, get an upgrade on Yoda, and then you just start to mitigate for, you know, the rest of the game with that setup by like turn 2, turn 3. So I mean, it's not technically mid-range, but it's the most mid-rangey version of mill out there. And then I am personally working on, now I don't know if this is going to work or not. I've shown Nick this list and we can talk about it a little bit here. I'm working on a toolbox mill deck. So this is coming from the Tampa tournament we went to, and something I really enjoyed over Riken was Rose. So my deck is Elite Yoda, Rose, and the Jedi Partisan. So the biggest reason I like Rose is she's got specials on her that help make money. I don't really care about removing a damage from a support because I don't have any, but she does have less health than him, but I feel like her dice are much more toolboxy. What I mean by that is I want 2 Yoda dice over 1 Yoda die, 1 Riken die, and 1 Partisan die. I really think Yoda is the driving force, but Rose is also very scary because her 2 indirect damage can proc off the Jedi Partisan because his effect doesn't say after Partisan deals indirect damage, it just says after you.
Yeah.
So like you can sack the Partisan into the garbage chute. You can roll out Rose and still mill. Yeah, she also has Disrupt, which is valuable now. She has Discard, which is valuable, and she has Double Special, which means more money. So you can roll her out, and if she doesn't roll something you want, you can roll Yoda and then do like a special chain to make shields, mill, and then money off of Rose. If she rolls into the discard, like that's valuable. She's got plenty of health. Like she's not like a threat, but she's going to be a deal. Like she's going to be something to deal with. More or less, like I still have 3 bodies, but I have the dice where I want them. Like instead of 1/1/1, I have 2/1/1, and both like all three, like Yoda, Rose, and the Partisan have discard and disrupt, which I want on my dice because I'm also running Rebel. So I'm going to go over the list. This is very preliminary, so I'm going to tweak it. And if it just doesn't work, I'm going to run some other mill deck. But I've got 2 chance cubes, 1 con artist, 1 force illusion, 2 force meditation, and 1 second chance. So we're just going to sit on the upgrade slots for a second here. Something we talked about in PAX Unplugged, and we've talked about this before on the show. What are the best cards in the game right now? And everyone agrees Force Illusion is by far one of the best cards in the game because for 1 resource, you can block a ton of damage. And if you stick this on a Yoda and then you have like a chance cube on him with a C-3PO, you've got a problem because I'm going to be able to flip the chance cube into the 3 using the Yoda special or even the double focus. And then I'm going to hit you with C-3PO to get cards out of your hand. If I've got a Force Illusion, like you have to deal with 10 health on Yoda, you're probably going to have to deal with an additional 3 shields on Yoda, and you have to deal with a Force Illusion. If Yoda goes down, I'm running Con Artist that I can put on the Jedha Partisan, and I have a second chance, so it makes it really hard to kill him. Like I can spread out my threats. This is not like the perfect upgrade comp, but it throws enough threats at you where if Yoda doesn't have something on him, you got to worry about the Partisan. And if you kill the Partisan, Yoda's going to step up and start to hurt you.
Yeah, I like the idea of it with too, like with Rainbow Rican Mill, you're sitting there with 3 dice total. You need to get something off the table. Partisan is like usually the first target, which turns off good garbage shoots and easy pickings. When you're running 2 die Yoda and 2 die Rose, just the 1 die Partisan there, like it's not doing much other than enabling cards in your deck and kind of milling, not necessarily even every round, but the risk of going after Partisan first when you have a 2 die Yoda seems like it's probably not even as much worth it for a damage based deck where you need to get Yoda off the table as fast as you can, ideally before your deck is gone.
I'm only running 1 die. It's only 1.
Oh, it's only 1 die Yoda. Okay.
No. Well, it's 2 die Yoda because he's 13, yeah. And then Rose is at 8, and then Partisan is at 8. So you're at 29 points.
Yeah. Okay. So 1 die Rose. Yeah. Okay. Still, the point being is that Yoda is the big threat there, and Yoda has to die over the Partisan, which I think gives it a little bit like that. That's a lot better than having to deal with the Rainbow Rican one where you just kill the Partisan first. I just think you'll get punished a lot harder if Yoda's alive for the whole game in this version.
Right, and you can put chance cubes on Rose. Or, I mean, if you need to, you can put him on Yoda and then bounce him and then put him on another character. So realistically, like the Con Artist is to throw aggro off of Yoda because if Partisan starts getting rolling with Con Artist, like that's, 1 card. And then the second turn, it's 3 cards because you add, 2. And then the third turn, it's another 3 cards. So you're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, like that's 6 cards. It's the same scale as Force Meditation because it's 2, 2, 2. But once you get to that 4th turn, then it's outpacing the Force Meditation. So if you get the lucky hand, you could put like a Force Meditation on Yoda and a Con Artist on the Jedha Partisan. Now you have a problem because if you go for Yoda, the Partisan is going to start to get out of control. And then if you go for the Partisan, Yoda is just going to constantly hit that deck.
I mean, you can even put a Force Meditation on Rose too, right? Because it's just spot up blue character.
Yep, absolutely. So the entire premise of these upgrades is that they're impactful, but they also force you to make a decision. Now, of course, if you're running big explosive decks and you get the God roll, you could kill the Partisan turn 1 and everything I say just doesn't matter. But we're going to talk about the event suite because that should help mitigate some of those problems. So the support block, you're going to look at 2 C-3PO, 2 Scrap Heap, 1 Street Informants. Now, this is a card that Nick and I have talked about. C-3PO is pretty stock. You use him in combination with Chance Cube. Scrap Heap, you make money when you mill, so easy money. This is up for debate. This is a flex slot, which could change in the future, but I personally want to know what's in my opponent's hand, because if I know what you've got, I can play around it. If you've got a bunch of mitigation, I'm going to probably roll and resolve. If you've just got a bunch of upgrades in your hand, I know that I can roll my guys out and you can't do squat. And if I know I'm not getting cards out of your hand, but every turn I can just activate this and immediately know, oh, hey, if I'm playing Sabine, there's a never telling me the odds. I need to be aware of that. So I should probably push for discard really heavily. Or, if you've got like 2 Maz's Vaults, 2 easy pickings, and a gun. Oh, all right. Well, you have an upgrade you're probably going to pitch to reroll and then use Sabine to try and, action sheet. And then you have some removal. So if I just roll out Rose and resolve her, you can't hit me with pickings. And then the Partisan, so on and so forth. Like I can play around what you have if I know it's in your hand. Now, Nick had some other thoughts about this, and I'm curious what you think about it now.
I mean, I don't think it's like the worst card. It's certainly nice to have the information there. Whether it's the best card in like your 30th slot is kind of probably up to you. Yeah, having hand knowledge is nice. If you have like something like scruffy looking nerf herder too, knowing what you're walking into before that's kind of nice, even if you don't have the ability to do it right afterwards without them reacting. Yeah, I mean, it's not terrible. It's more of a personal choice than anything.
Yeah, but I mean, if there was something else you would be interested in putting in, like, what would you think?
Oh, probably another piece of removal in place of it, just to help out with that, depending on how your economy looks. If you're not running Entangle, so I'm probably running Entangle.
Oh, I'm running Entangle.
Scruffy looking nerf herder, you got that one too?
No, I don't. I will actually just go into it right now. So the event block, I'm running 2 Caution, 2 Easy Pickings, 1 Emergency Evacuation, 2 Entangle, 2 Entrenched, 1 Fall Back, 1 Hyperspace Jump, 2 Into the Garbage Chute, 1 Mend, 2 Overconfidence, and 2 Rebel.
Yeah, I really do like Rebel, especially when you have all 4 dice have a discard side on them base.
So I actually took the idea of using Rebel from Desmond, I believe his last name is Brody, when we were talking on Countdown to Worlds about his deck that was running Rebel in conjunction with Impulsive. And he was able to like focus into something that would, you know, be showing the discard side. And then with the cheat, you know, the action sheet, he could play Rebel and get something out onto the table that the opponent wasn't expecting. Like, you know, you can use your Hyperspace Jump from the graveyard. I can do like a Fall Back from the graveyard. I can do Emergency Evacuation. So even though I have all these one-ofs, like I can Easy Pickings from my discard pile. Like that's the really scary thing is I'm sitting on, you know, 2 copies of some of these cards, 1 copy of others. But if I'm showing discard, which I really want because I need to get cards out of your hand, if I get lucky and roll out and I have the resources and, you know, say I roll Yoda and I get, you know, a special and a discard, and you know that the 2 Easy Pickings are in my discard pile. Okay, I'm not afraid. I'm going to roll out something that has a lot, you know, say it's an Obi-Wan. Roll out my Obi-Wan, get double 3s. All right, well, I'm going to play Rebel and Easy Pickings you from my discard pile. It's like, what? Oh no. I mean, of course, a good player is going to be aware of that, but it basically gives me an extra zone of cards to play around with, which I think is going to be very helpful for this deck because having cards in my hand and in my discard pile that I have access to is really, really usable.
Yeah, I think it's just a good kind of, it is a good sneaky card that isn't seeing much play at all right now. But like, yeah, if your deck has 4 character dice that all have discard size on it, you might consider running it because it's basically every removal that you've used that game or an upgrade that got discarded out of your hand. Like it's the most flexible card for removal and just pulling stuff from your discard pile. It's just one constraint of having a discard side, which, you know, a mill deck can handle it. They can get there, because that's what they want to be seen anyways.
Yeah. So like I said, I'm going to be testing this and figuring out what needs to change, if anything, or if I need to just go to a different deck altogether. The battlefield is Otogunga, in case you're wondering. So I mean, I'm just more or less curious to see how this fares against the field. So far in testing, it's done well, but I haven't gotten in, you know, hundreds of reps yet. That's to be seen. But the biggest reason I wanted to bring this to the table was like the current state of mill decks right now is like just mill and remove dice. So it's fairly straightforward. This gives me a little bit of control over my environment. So with Force Illusion and Second Chance, my guys are going to stay on the table longer. The other thing about Rebel, and don't forget, it says you can play a card from your discard pile. So it's not just events. If you hit me and get rid of my C-3PO with a Vandalize, or if you pop off my Second Chance, I can still Rebel and get a Second Chance back on. Like, I technically have access to 3 Second Chances, 3 Force Illusions. Like, I can keep putting these cards back on my characters, and just because I discard it doesn't mean it's gone, which is, I think, very disingenuous, because I can like pitch a Second Chance to reroll and someone's like, oh, okay, well, I guess, you know, that's it. And then you hit Rebel, you get it back on, and it's like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and it also helps for, like, especially when you lose those hyperspace jumps too, because even though you can still use them only twice, like being able to get that after it's discarded from your hand from like a scruffy looking nerf herder is just so the kind of thing that could just win a match versus vehicles, like a deck that's really slow and needs those times. And if they get your jump and you can still use it, that's just money.
Yeah. And speaking of which, that's going to be the next deck that we talk about. So great segue, Nick. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the vehicle deck, since you're the more experienced pilot in that deck?
Yeah, so vehicles has kind of been around for most of this Legacies meta here, kind of doing well. That the first weekend that Legacies was actually legal for the regionals. The most common version is Elite Ayla, Elite Rose, and Ezra Bridger. Not necessarily the only version you're going to see out there. There's been, I mean, the most other common one I've seen out there for hero vehicles is the Elite Ezra Elite Yoda Rookie Pilot that does some fun different things. Like at its core, you build it like a very similar deck. The things you kind of lose are you don't get to use Modified Hawk, and otherwise you have a much more resource heavy, less base damage kind of deck. But the idea behind the standard Ayla Rose Ezra version is you just have a lot of really good vehicles. You have 4 2-drop vehicles and about 4 to 5 3-drop vehicles, and you have really good cards for getting them out, like Tech Team and Rally Aid. Like those are your money makers, basically. Like they're 1-cost supports that generate more money in the long run. You have 3PO for your consistency engine in the deck, and R2D2 to kind of help out with that as well, because 2 consistency droids is pretty good there. And then it's like you have your vehicles, you have your money, you have your consistency cards like 3PO and R2, and then pretty much the rest of it's removal or mitigation with stuff like cautions, easy picking, into the garbage chute, flank, overconfidence. You could run entangle, pin down. Scruffy Looking Nerf Herder is probably one of the only more tech cards that isn't really for mitigation. That's like your one event that you're really using to try to get rid of the hyperspace jumps or the removal in a round where you know that you have to hit for 12 to 13 damage to be able to kill off a character. And then Vandalize is another common pick to put in the deck to be able to help with stuff like Force Illusion, or previously I'd say it was for running interference, and if that's not as big of a problem now, Maul Saber, if that comes down round 1, it's pretty good to Vandalize. But yeah, otherwise you're really just looking to ramp out as many vehicles as you can early. Ayla helps out a lot with just some early damage. Just being able to put 2-3 damage here on a character really helps you to be able to kind of like, it's probably not common you'll kill a character on round 2 in a 2-character deck, but you have enough mitigation options that you should be okay if you lose a character in round 2. But you can definitely go off in round 3. Round 3 and round 4 are where this deck really shines. I mean, as long as you don't have a really, really bad setup, you can just get some really good consistent, like 8 to 10 damage on the 3rd and 4th round, just blowing out after their removal even. Ezra's usually kind of one of the bigger targets because he has the easy pickings and he's the best garbage chute candidate to be able to exhaust to remove those dice. So a lot of people like killing Ezra. He's also got the least health. Otherwise, Rose dies pretty much first or second because she has your money. She's the thing that basically helps you win the game. She helps with by removing the damage tokens off the modified Hawk, which otherwise you would be dealing indirect damage to yourself. And every once in a while people do go after Ayla first, but it feels bad because like the only thing she really gives your deck is damage and a little bit of consistency, but she's a 10 HP sponge with good dice, but doesn't really turn off a lot of your cards if she dies. That's probably why it's not as incentivized to remove her first. The vehicles you're running, like the 2 costs, there's only 3 2-cost vehicles you can really run. The T-47 Airspeeder, the Modified Hawk 290, and the Headhunter. I forget what the number is, Z96 or something like that, Headhunter. That one's not very commonly played. Again, I think you'll see that if you see the Yoda Ezra version, because you just need another 2-drop vehicle. It replaces the Hawk. It's not as good as the Hawk. It has a 1, a 2 for 1, and a 3 for 1 range, and then garbage, 2 blanks, and a resource. So it's not as good of a vehicle for sure than as Hawk, but it's really not as bad as you think when you make enough money for it. It's still got 3 damage sides at the end of the day. It's still got a 3 side at the end of the day. So 3 cost vehicles, you're pretty much going to be looking at Y-Wings guaranteed. And I would like to say you can see most people running Fang Fighter, but I've seen decks that don't run it. I've seen decks that run ETA Interceptor as well, or instead of Fang Fighter. And there's also Resistance Bomber, but honestly, Resistance Bomber doesn't really feel great with this kind of list unless you're really running for some extra stuff, like trying to hit with like a sudden impact to be able to deal 3 damage to all your opponent's character. Like it's better for some trickier stuff or trying to do planned explosion, but all in all, like the Resistance Bomber, when you just look at it, it's kind of just worse than Y-Wing most of the time. And if you have to pay for the 6 for 2 side, it feels really bad unless it's like winning you the game. So not as big of a fan of the Bomber. That's why it hasn't made the cut for my list in a while. But Fang Fighter feels really good just because it's a relatively cheap vehicle. It costs 3 because there's not a lot of other 3 cost vehicles, and it has the 3 direct damage side where the ETA has only a 3 indirect damage side. Yeah, the vehicles deck does fairly well versus a lot of the meta. I wouldn't say it's super behind in most of the matchups. Boba 7th, obviously it hurts if you lose Rose round 1. Losing Ezra round 1 can happen a lot easier, and it's still not great, but it's not the end of the world still. Versus stuff like Sabine, it's really just a race. You have at least 3 rounds that your characters will live, because you got 3 of them and they're not going to be able to chew through that much health in only a couple rounds. So you got at least get that going for you. Expect, like, if you survive through round 4, expect that you pretty much have to win at the end of round 4 versus Sabine, or else you're going to be toast unless they rolled fairly awful for the most of the game. I mean, it's a low health deck, and if you pressure them long enough, then they'll probably have to spend second chance, which will set them behind in resources, which will set them behind in damage. So, like, if you get a lot of damage out early and actually race them down, you can win fairly consistently versus Sabine. Obviously, the worst thing I'd say is hyperspace jump. Like, of all the things that you don't want to see, that's the big one. And that's, if you can avoid that, you'll probably be able to win your games. But jumps in a lot of decks now too, so that's why I'd say scruffy looking nerf herder is kind of just necessary, because you got to get it out. Even if they're going to rebel it back, if you can stop it for the round it's out, it's in their hand, that's usually good enough.
Right. So let's talk about matchups. Now, traditionally, mill decks versus vehicle decks, not a great matchup for vehicle decks. So that's just kind of a give and take. But it's not like necessarily over if I sit down across from you and you're playing vehicles and I'm playing mill.
No, there's definitely a lot of nuance to it, and it depends what kind of mill deck are being played too. I think the vehicles is a little bit better versus the 2-character mill decks, because even while they can mill off the top of your deck faster, they don't have as good of removal and do not have nearly as much health. So your chances of just being able to blow them up in kind of one fell swoop is at least a little better feeling. I think it does better versus the Riken Yoda instead of like Padme Yoda, where you still have like access to yellow and hyperspace jump, because hyperspace jump is still really crucial. But
right, and I have to be careful of letting you get lots of stuff out on the table,
which is,
so I'm going to have to aggressively push to get cards out of your deck. And if I see, I get both Hawks, okay, that's one victory right there.
That's the cheap one. It's going to net me the most value in the long run of the game. Like versus mill, most of the mill decks right now don't do very well about getting a lot of cards out of your hand on the first round. The only way that's happening is if they get like 3PO out and have like a 2 side that they're not going to use on one of their other dice. Like, it's possible that you lose cards from your hand round 1, but it's not nearly as likely as it is going to be in the late game, where you have like little chance of holding on to the rest of your hand.
Right. And we were talking about that with my deck, because all 3 of them, so Yoda, Rose, and Jedha have two sides. Well, they have the value of 2 on their dice. So the Partisan has 2 sides. Rose has the 2 indirect. Yoda has the 2 focus. So if I can get that C-3PO out turn 1, I can legitimately roll out to try and get 2 cards out of your hand, which I think that's pretty impactful for turn 1.
Yeah, and part of it depends too on how much you're focusing, like, because if you roll the 2 indirect side, you might actually want to get the 1 at least off the deck for that. Yoda's 2 focus obviously has value outside of that, so it's not as likely. I still think that you're going to hit your hand that hard round 1. But that being said, like, having multiple vehicles in your starting hand, I still feel is very beneficial for the vehicle deck, because you have no control over what gets milled off the top of your deck. The thing that you have the most control over is your starting hand. And pretty much the first round, you want to get as many resources as you possibly can, so you can throw down any vehicle that even comes into your hand as fast as you can, because you want to get them down before they get taken away from you. Obviously, your battlefield helps, and you should do fairly well against most mill decks in the battlefield roll-off, which is at least a good thing.
So if we're not facing off against each other and we're going into worlds, we're going to see other things. So, if you're playing mill and you see, we'll talk about Boba 7th. That's an extremely popular deck right now. A lot of people are playing it. It's very potent. It's very consistent. So you're going to have to just accept the fact that you are going to most likely see your big lightsabers like Heirloom or Maul Saber either turn 1 or turn 2. So your big targets are going to be getting that die off the table and keeping shields on your character. So shields come from Yoda. Partisan helps with your easy pickings, your entangle, you're into the garbage chute. The mill strategy when you're facing off against Boba 7th is keep their damage offline as much as possible. You've got the emergency evacuation and the fallback to help deal with overwhelming numbers of die or upgrades. If they just drop like, double ancient and an heirloom, like that's pretty impactful, and you should probably have a way to deal with it. So you've got fallback. You know, you can mill pretty heavily from hand if you need to. You can do some rerolls or some flips using Yoda to get into Rose and the Partisans discard. You know, you've got the pieces of the pie, but with any mill deck, you have to know, like, you will never kill any character. So for the entirety of the game, like, both of those characters and their dice are on the table. So you have to figure out where to take damage, where to put shields, when to play your, you know, removal, because sometimes it's fine to take 3 or 5 damage if you've got like 2 shields on the Yoda and they swing out, and you know, maybe you've got a mend in your hand, so you can do something where, you know, they resolve 2 or 3 of their dice, they eat through your shields, Yoda puts 3 damage on him. All right, you just mend. So instead of removing dice with a removal event, you basically remove dice. Well, you remove the damage the dice dealt. So you still didn't take any damage, and you used a card to mitigate away the damage you would have taken. So like, it's just understanding when and where your cards and dice need to be utilized. But it is it's a matchup you can absolutely win. You just have to be very careful in how you use the equipment you've been given.
Yeah, and the more aggressive decks in general are usually the hardest for Mill to deal with, because the earlier you lose a character, the less effective you become, obviously with any deck. But since you're not fighting back, it's even more doubly, because they're never going to lose the character.
So what about if vehicles are playing against Boba 7th?
Yeah, so vehicles versus Boba 7th. The big things you have to watch out for. Round 1, Abandon All Hope kind of sucks for you. It kind of sucks for them a little bit too, but definitely sucks for you not having been able to even get that one vehicle out, since most of your damage is coming from vehicles versus, I'd say most of their damage is coming from their character dice. And then all the extra upgrades are just more to pile it on. So getting Abandon All Hope early is awful, and there's not much you can do about it. Otherwise, like, as long as you have a good mitigation or 2, 2 is especially helpful for the first round against that deck, or any deck that you might really worry about friends in low places. Obviously, you want some of your ramp cards and vehicles as well. But the big thing is, as long as you don't lose a character round 1 and actually get to use its dice into round 2, like if they go after Rose first, as long as Rose gets to resolve her dice into both the first and the second round, I think you're in a good spot in that game. And a lot of that just comes down to that deck only has 21 health itself, and it just doesn't have any of the big blowout stuff that all the other decks do to be able to deal with you having tons of damage. Like, the most of the removal that deck has is there's like a few 1-cost removals, like Overconfidence or Feel Your Anger, but actually a lot of it's 0 with like the doubts and the hidden motives and the he doesn't like you. So it's got some good removal, it's got some of the it's got a lot of the cheap removal, and he doesn't like you still is not the worst for you, because it still hurts their maximum damage, and that's actually fine, much more so than big blowout things like Easy Pickings or Into the Garbage Chute, or even most notably stuff like a Hyperspace Jump. So the big thing is mitigating their damage early, mitigating their damage when you can, and just out ramping them and blowing them up in round 3 or 4. Honestly, the most scary card that deck has is the Close Quarters Assault. Being able to roll out well, especially if you don't have the mitigation for it. Like, it's a card that kind of doubly punishes you when you don't have the right hand for the job. If you only have vehicles and ramp in your hand and no removal, and they roll out 8 damage on 4 dice, and then they hit you with the rest of your hand gone, that is just basically one of the biggest swings you could possibly hope for in the game. And it's just awful to sit across. And there's not a lot you can do about it. Maybe that's the card that you use Scruffy Looking Nerf Herder for, but in general, like, that's the worst case scenario. You'll usually have something to deal with it. You'll usually only get hit for 2 by it, or two is okay, but not great. Be aware of it. Be aware that every Boba 7th should be running that, and if they aren't, expect them to, because if you're not playing, like, they could use it at any time, you could just get punished. And sometimes the play around that is being able to, like, ralliate into a position where you have no business ralliating because you only have 1 vehicle in hand, but on the chance that you might not lose the rest of your hand and be able to actually play that vehicle could be everything in a game. Or even be able to, like, play multiple things by actually utilizing the Fang Fighter's ambush to just discard your own hand, but actually get everything out of it before they can discard the rest of your hand. It's certainly interesting, the kind of play that you have to make around it, but it's not an awful matchup for either side.
All right, so the next deck I want to address really quickly is Hondo. We've talked about him a lot. We've talked about him so much. He is going to see play. You're going to see him at Worlds. You're going to see him a lot of different places. And You know, it really depends on where they spend that money. If they roll out Hondo right off the bat, that means, you know, they decided not to play the cunning turn 1. So I would probably be willing to accept 6 damage to the face so that I can spend my resources to get out my upgrades. Now, if I have a chance cube in my hand, you know, it changes my plays because I could just roll out chance cube and maybe just take 3 resources right off the bat if I didn't get the C3PO, and then I can just give them a bunch of money. But then, of course, if I give them money, that gives them fuel, which means more damage to deal with unless I want to actually put up with. So it's just tricky. In my head, like the optimal play is they roll out Hondo and then I hit him with, you know, easy pickings or entangle and just get rid of those specials, and then I'm good for the rest of the turn. Like, Yoda is not going to do anything to me that I'm really scared of. Like, yes, they'll make resources and shields, but I don't care about those things. I care about damage. And if they mill me, if they try and counter mill me, okay, sure, that's fine. So I'm really mostly focused on Hondo dealing damage. And of course, if they throw out that force wave, I have to respect that. I have to be very careful that, you know, if they have 3 resources, they can get force wave, Yoda can flip into it, make the resource he needs, and then just start hurting my team so quickly because I have 3 characters, force wave hits 3 characters, and that's no joke. So there's a lot of considerations, and when you're playing against Hondo, you do have to be careful that you don't feed the beast too much because eventually you are going to have to give them money. But if you mill them early on and you get the double force wave, or you get like a force wave and a cunning or something, like you can start to make an educated guess. You know, they might have it in their hand. If they haven't played it yet, they probably don't have it in their hand. And so you can start to aggressively push to try and get through the deck to get rid of all the threatening upgrades. And so if you're just sitting on Hondo with like 1 cunning for the entire game, you'll probably be okay because you can mitigate away plenty of the dice, and then you can just take 3 damage here and there because Yoda will have enough shields. You've got Entrench to help create shields. You've got enough ways to deal with it that you should be okay. If you absolutely had to, you could always use Chance Cube and C3PO to make shields. I don't think you need to. You really need to hit the hand, but there's ways to get around it because Hondo has to play fair. He doesn't really have ways to cheat through shields, which is nice.
And for vehicles versus Yoda Hondo, it's kind of a rough match actually for vehicles. The biggest thing you have to do is stay ahead on money early, which is kind of hard because you can't give them money early, which is the problem because you need to not let them ramp up. If they ramp up, then what you're going to see is the force wave coming down, like guaranteed round 2, along with a bunch of mitigation. And that's kind of the crux of it, is force wave is just obliterating for vehicles. It's so much damage. It'll chew through your team super fast. And if they have force wave and cunning down, cunning makes force wave even cheaper because it doesn't have the paid side on it. It's just kind of like a nightmare overall. Now, it's not like the matchup is always just a nightmare kind of matchup. It is just that it can snowball out of effect really fast if they get the right upgrades. And that's what it feels more like the deck is dealing. You're kind of at the mercy of what upgrades they happen to get on their characters. Yeah, getting ahead on resources early helps. Just being able to pressure damage, like being able to kill off a character as early as you possibly can is probably the most important part. And I think the target has to be Yoda because of the threat of Force Wave. That being said, they can just kind of load up Hondo a lot of times, and that could be pretty awful. But if the worst you're dealing with is stuff like light bows and cunnings, it's not nearly as bad, I think, as free Force Waves with cunnings.
Yeah, that's pretty rough.
Yeah. So, I mean, double force wave is just really hard to be able to deal with. You just you really need the ramp cards. You really need the tech teams and the rally aids to win that matchup. Like, without that, it just feels like you can't actually get ahead of them on money, because if you're spending it all on vehicles or paying them, then you're either dying slowly or you're making the ramp up faster, or you're just not actually playing any upgrades yourself. Like, it just feels lose-lose if you don't get your ramp out early. Even if your round one is just resolving a bunch of money after they've had any chance of disrupting you, playing like 3PO, a tech team, and a rally aid. Like, if that's your round one and you end up coming into round two with like 3 or 4 resources, well, if you end the round with 3 resources, you come into like 5. So if you're coming into round 2 starting after you got your resource with 4 to 5 resources, that's probably one of your best spots. So even if you didn't play vehicle then, but then you actually have to draw a vehicle in the next round and hope you don't get screwed by that. Not to mention, on top of all of that, the deck also has hyperspace jump and rebel a lot of times now too. So there's a lot going for it, and it's really hard to keep up with it a lot of times, even if you have a lot of health and a decent way of making money. I'd say that the Yoda Ezra rookie pilot version does a little bit better at that, because it's even better at making money itself. on top of being able to pressure your opponent's money with Ezra specials and even threatening Yoda to chain into your Ezra specials. So overall, it's a lot more. It does make more money. It does kind of keep your opponent down, and hopefully you can still ramp out kill with your vehicles. So I like that matchup a little bit better for vehicles, but the Ayla Rose one definitely feels like it's on the losing side of it right now.
All right, so let's talk about the hyper aggressive decks. So obviously Sabine, OTK, those are going to be pushing for maximum damage turn 1, hoping to kill a character, and then turn 2 just overwhelm you with gratuitous amounts of damage, going for that running interference, never tell me the odds play, or price of failure leadership, and just roll lots of dice. So something that this deck is going to suffer from hyper aggression is a lot of these combo pieces sit in the opponent's hand. So you have to be very wary of the dice on the table, but you also have to be aware of these combo pieces that are going to be enabling the deck. So if you're playing a mill deck, like one of the things I have to do, and the problem is it's really slow. So like you got to roll out your character with a chance cube, you got to roll out the C-3PO, and then on top of that, if you didn't hit the 3, you're going to have to get Yoda online somehow to try and special chain to get that 3 showing, and then resolve 3PO. So that's a lot of actions, and it's very telegraphed what you're trying to do. So sometimes you just roll out the Yoda and maybe hope that you get, 2 discards, or you get a discard and something else. Like there's a lot of different lines of play, but more importantly, especially against OTK, you got to try and get cards out of the hand, because that's where the danger is coming from. Like the dice are scary, don't get me wrong, but it's even worse if you roll out Seventh Sister 3 times in that turn and you didn't use your cards and your effects to get double price of failure and leadership out of the opponent's hand. Like you've probably lost the game at that point. So you've got to try and get those dice on the table, get high values, and use 3PO to get cards out of their hand. At that point, like you can use the Jetta Partisan with Garbage Chute. That's going to eat a lot of dice, because all of their damage comes from values on the dice. You're not going to be doing a lot of special chaining with OTK. Same thing with Sabine. You're not really doing any special chaining. You're just going to show damage, and you can use Partisan. You can use easy pickings. You can use even emergency evacuation. If Sabine and Ezra both roll out, you can just hit them with emergency evac, and that's a lot of dice off the table. A smart player should see that you have 4 resources, not roll out all their characters, and let you just get a free emergency evacuation off. So that is something to consider, but there's just a lot of different things you need to do. But you absolutely have to be afraid and respect these combo pieces coming out of your opponent's hand, because like I said, you don't kill anyone. So they're just going to sit there every single round and roll out their dice. But if they're trying to go for big blowout plays and you can get those cards out of their hand, then they have to play fair. And then you can remove all their dice with all of your event suite and, use your shields, use your mend, use your heals, and you should be able to sustain out the turns.
Yeah, for the combo stuff like OTK for vehicles, at least you have a few good options. If you're running Vandalize, you can just nuke the upgrades for OTK, and that really goes a lot longer way than you might think to setting it behind because when you're trying to reactivate your character multiple times, if you're doing it with 1 less die, it's like getting double the value off of that upgrade removal. So that part is quite invaluable. So Vandalize is great. Scruffy looking Nerf herder can come in clutch there for being able to just end some of the shenanigans they're going to do or know what's coming. You can either hit the boundless, you can either hit the boundless, the leadership, or the price of failure there. Those are kind of like the 3 big ones. Overall, I'd say like you can't race the Seventh Sister down on damage like you might with some of the other more aggressive decks. You might just have to kill off the Night Sister just so they get 1 less activation, less of the free rerolls. It's unfortunate that might be the best way to handle things, but yeah, I don't think the matchup's as awful as some people might think about it, because you do have a lot of tools with vehicles to be able to deal with it if they're in the decks, and I think a lot of the vehicles decks do have those tools, on top of just being able to dish out a lot of damage themselves in the 3rd and 4th round, which if you can just stave off your health a little bit till then, you should be fine. Versus the other aggressive decks, like something like a Boba Phasma or some of the more rampy Ayla decks, I think you're actually in quite a good position, because for the most part, those are the kind of decks that your removal is really meant to kind of kill. Like your removal works super well against decks that play fairly, for one, which not all of the super aggressive decks play super fairly, but usually they're not going to be resolving all their damage at once, especially in the early rounds. and having, or they're not going to roll out all their dice at once and hit perfect damage to resolve it all with action sheets. But in general, like, you do have some pretty good matchups versus something like Boba Phasma because you have such solid removal versus it when it doesn't have as good of removal itself. And just like, yeah, you have a huge health advantage because of the 2 characters versus the 3. That's always a big deal. Some good shield options too.
Any last matchups you want to talk about before we get out of here?
I don't think so. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of other crazy stuff that'll pop up for Worlds, but we can't plan for everything, even if we try.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, is just learning your deck, learning the matchups you know are coming. Like, these decks are going to be at Worlds. There's a lot of people who can just decide, I'm going to run a rogue deck. I'm going to run a deck you've never seen before. We never know and can never consider all of the variables. So we can do the best we can with what information we have and then go from there. But, you know, if you're listening, you're getting ready for Worlds, there's a lot of stuff going on. So if you haven't heard already, we are doing a 3v3 tournament on Thursday night. We are doing a happy hour on Friday night. So we are going to be doing all kinds of super fun community events. So check that out on our Facebook. So a big thank you to all of our Patreons for supporting us on the show. Thank you to our new Patreon, Michael Stoll and John Linehan, for increasing your pledge. We greatly appreciate all of your support, and we are going to be bringing you a ton of coverage from Worlds, live streams, podcasts, videos, all of that good stuff for free. We love doing all this media content. I am so excited to meet all of our old friends, to meet new friends, and just have a blast. So if you have any questions, you want to know more, check us out on Facebook, check out all of our events on our page. And that's pretty much it for the show. So thank you for listening. We will see you next time, and may the Force be with you.
So glad we took this job!
Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join us on all of our social media outlets. And a big thank you to all of our Patreons for your support. We can't do this without your help, so make sure to join us for all of our exclusive Knights of Ren content.